everything, and ding. There we go. All right, so where were we? We were talking about the idea that life on Earth has a history. It's got a time dimension. And if you want to understand it, you have to know something about that history for exactly the same reason that if you want to understand the history of a country, you have to know, or you want to understand the society and politics of a country, you have to understand that country's history. We have to do the same thing with life. And fossils give us a way to reconstruct what the history of life was. But around dates a million years or more, where do we actually get those numbers? You know, what is it that tells you that those bones that you're looking at are 145 million years old? Well, it got worked out by a guy named Arthur Holmes, who, this should make you feel really bad about yourself, was still an undergraduate at the time at Durham University in Northern England. And he worked out how to use this thing that had only recently been discovered, a phenomenon called radioactivity. I assume you have heard of radioactivity before. I certainly have. It always gives me a glow. And it's fairly familiar now, but I've actually heard of people who don't realize that radioactivity is something that occurs in nature. You hear about bombs, nuclear bombs and nuclear reactors that have something to do with radioactivity. And some people tend to think it's all a man-made thing. But in fact, there are plenty of, substances on this planet that are radioactive. Now, what's that mean? Other than, was that Imagine Dragons did that radioactive song? My kid would know, I don't. But what does it actually mean? Okay, everything is made up of atoms. Like as they say, never trust atoms because they make up everything. Most atoms are stable. You're made up of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen atoms, among others. Almost all of those atoms, with a very small number of exceptions, like the type of carbon called carbon-14, but you have very little of that. Almost all of the atoms that make you up are going to be around countless millions of years from now. There might be processes that could alter them in some way or destroy them, but barring something like, the collapse of a star or something like that, the atoms that make you up could exist until the end of the universe, whatever that might be. Radioactive atoms are not like that because they give off energy in various forms, and that causes them to change. They become atoms of different elements. So if you were to start with an atom of the element uranium, specifically a type of uranium called uranium-238, that will eventually, if you give it time, will give off some energy in a form that we call an alpha particle and transform into an atom of a different chemical element, an element called thorium. That will transform, given enough time, into an atom of an element called protactinium, giving off what's called a beta particle as it does that. And then the protactinium will transform into an atom of uranium-234, going through a whole series of transformations, and eventually, given enough time, it will end up as an atom of the element lead. Once it reaches lead, nothing happens to it. Lead is stable. Lead atoms could potentially last as long as the universe does. Okay, what you're seeing there is a diagram of what we call the uranium decay series. Each one of those little stop sign things represents an atom of a different chemical element, and the arrows represent what transforms into what. Okay, right. Okay, I'm not going to say that much about how it works because we've got a perfectly good physics department. But the upshot is that decay does not happen at a constant rate. It's not like every uranium atom exists for 4 billion years and then on cue will transform into thorium. What does happen is that we can measure the decay of large samples of atoms, relatively big lumps of uranium, and express that decay by calculating a quantity called the half-life. The way I always think of half-lives is, imagine that in a time before the coronavirus pandemic that we're going through, we had a football game at Bear Stadium, and the place was packed absolutely full. Everybody was having a great time. The band was playing Carmina Burana on the kickoff like they do, and everything was great, and it was a good, hard-fought game. And everybody stayed in their seats until the final whistle was blown. Then what? Well, everybody gets up to leave, but some people are going to beat it out of there as fast as they can and go running to their cars. And some people are going to, not be any hurry. Maybe they've got people they want to talk to. Maybe they're going to, hang out with the players for a little bit. Maybe they are happy just to wait and avoid the rush of people all trying to get out at once. So some of the people are going to leave early. Some of the people are going to leave late. And by the time you get to about 30 minutes, there's probably nobody much there except maybe for the custodial staff, right? I assume you have gone to games or heard of people who've gone to games. If you don't like football, this works perfectly well for soccer or baseball or what have you. Anyway, imagine that you're flying over the stadium in the Goodyear blimp and you're looking down, watching what people are doing. Now, everybody is doing something a little bit different, and you can't really see from way up there what individuals are doing, but you could measure, okay, in the first 5 minutes after the final whistle is blown, the stadium becomes half empty. And then in the next 5 minutes after that, the stadium loses half of the people that are left in it, and only a quarter of the people are still left, right? Maybe the people who are, friends of the players or people who are watching the color guard or something like that. And then after another 5 minutes, half of those people have left and we only have an eighth of the original crowd. And after another 5 minutes, half of that eighth is left and we only have 1/16 of the people left, and so on. Then the number just keeps dwindling away. We can calculate a length of time that we call the half-life, and that's the length of time it would take for, in this case, for half of the people in the stadium to leave. And when we apply it to radioactive elements, that's the length of time that it takes for half a sample of atoms to decay. And then half of the remaining sample is lost after 2 half-lives, and then half of that is lost after 3 half-lives, and so on. You keep having every time. So I'm going to go back a slide. The half-life of uranium-238 happens to be 4.5 billion years. What that means is that if you had a big lump of uranium-238, in 4.5 billion years, half that lump would have changed into something else. And then after another 4.5 billion years, half of that half would have changed into something else. And then after yet another 4.5 billion years, half of that half would have changed into something else, and so on. Uranium turns into thorium-234, which has a half-life of 27 days. So if I had a lump of thorium-234 on my desk, half of it would not be thorium-234 after 27 days, and only a quarter of it would be left after 54 days, and only a quarter of that, 1/8, would be left after, or only, okay, half would be gone after 27 days, 3/4 of it's gone after 54 days, 7/8 would be gone after 81 days, 15/16 would be gone after 108 days, and so on. That amount of thorium-234 gets divided in half after every half-life. Okay, all right. What Holmes did was come up with ways that you could measure the amount of a natural radioactive element called the parent element in a rock and the amount of daughter element, the element that the parent converts into. And you could measure both and use the ratio between parent element and daughter element, like the ratio of uranium to lead, as a way to calculate the age of the rock. And the first time he did it, basically just using stuff in his undergraduate chemistry lab, the oldest rocks that he tested turned out to be about 2 billion years old. Since that time, we've gotten a lot better at doing this sort of thing. We have found much older rocks. The oldest actual, rocks that you could walk on and pick up a piece of and throw at somebody on the planet Earth are about 4 billion years old. We can even do better than that when we sample meteorites, rocks that, come out of space and pass through the atmosphere and land on the surface of the Earth. Those are thought to be leftovers from the origin of the solar system, and the oldest of those punch their clock at about 4.6 billion years old. Let me see if I can put that into some kind of perspective, because it's easy to throw around big numbers like million and billion. Okay, typical toilet paper roll is about 1,000 sheets. I mean, I think some rolls might be 500 and some are 1,000. It depends on what brand you get, I guess. But at least some of the rolls of toilet paper, which we now have in the stores, yay, go us, are about 1,000 sheets. Let's say that the entire history of the solar system, all the time that the Earth and the sun and the things that gave rise to them, all the time that that's been in existence, is represented by the length of one 1,000 sheet toilet paper roll. So in your mind's eye, or if you've got toilet paper handy, you could do this for real. Imagine unrolling a 1,000 sheet roll of toilet paper. All of human history, everything from, the pyramids to ancient Sumeria and Babylonia and the Greeks and the Romans and Ghana and Mali and Songhai and all of the dynasties of China, everything from the earliest written historical records all the way up to today would fit on the little fuzzy fringe at the end of the last sheet. That is how old we're talking about. And I calculated once that a human lifespan would be about the size of one bacterium. That gives you some idea of how old we're talking about, what 4.6 billion years actually means. It's a lot. We have gotten a lot better than we used to be at measuring the rate of the decay of radioactive elements, calculating the half-life, and we've gotten a lot better at counting atoms in very small samples. This gizmo is called a shrimp. That's a super high resolution ion microprobe, and I'm not sure I could explain how it works, and we don't need to know, except suffice it to say that this is a very good atom counter. This is the kind of thing you need if you're going to be counting the number of atoms of, let's say, uranium and lead in a rock sample. And we can do this now with much smaller samples than we used to have to do. So we've gotten a lot better at calculating those ages. And I don't have time to get into this, but there are factors that will throw off a radiometric date. There are things that can make any given date not accurate. However, we have various ways of cross-checking dates. When you measure the amounts of atoms in a rock sample and use that to estimate a date, that's a hypothesis, and there's ways of testing your hypothesis, most of which we don't really have time to get into. Be great if we could, but there's things like a method called the Concordia method if you're doing uranium, a method called isochron dating in the case of other elements that we might use. And of course, we can always use Steno's law. If we have rock layers from bottom to top that we can date at 50 million years, 40 million years, 30 million years, 3 billion years, 10 million years, that 3 billion year date is out of place. And there's probably something that's messing up that date. And there's various things that it could be. So we do have ways that we can cross-check our dates for accuracy, and there are ways that we can correct for various sources that can put inaccuracy into there. I don't have time to get into it more than that, but we've been doing this for over 100 years, and properly applied, it's a pretty darn reliable method. That's where we get those big numbers that I was throwing around. We've got means of directly calculating the ages of certain rocks. Okay, that's what we can do now. Now let's go back in time to 1831. Here's Captain Robert Fitzroy of the British Navy, who's preparing for a surveying voyage to South America. Britain, like any navy or anybody that's got ships, badly needs accurate maps and charts. It would do absolutely no good, to be sailing your very expensive fleet of warships and have them crash into a rock and have all your sailors drown because it ran into a rock that wasn't marked on the maps. So you need to have, and of course you still do, very accurate charts. I mean, these days everybody probably uses GPS, but I mean, you still need very accurate knowledge of where everything is in the seas that you're going to be sailing to. And the Royal Navy was sending out surveying voyages all over the world to chart various coastlines. And Fitzroy was in charge of one of these surveying voyages, one that was planned to last 3 years, whose job was to survey the coast of South America. And the ship that he sailed was called Her Majesty's ship Beagle. Not a very big ship, not one of these giant ships of the line that might carry, 120 guns or something like that. The Beagle could only carry 10. The Beagle is like, the Ford Ranger pickup of the time. It's not huge. It's not the kind of thing that can put up a sustained fight, and it's not intended to be. It's a small ship that was intended for surveying, running messages, maybe chasing off pirates and smugglers and things like that, not to put up sustained combat, but to do a whole bunch of little workhorse jobs that the Navy had, carrying messages, carrying mail, bringing supplies to various places and things like that. And because it was small, it could get into narrow bays and channels and things, and was very useful for surveying. The Navy also wanted to know things about South America, not just what does the land look like, or where are the rocks that we're going to run into if we're not careful. They wanted to know things like, let's say our ship does get wrecked here, where's the nearest big trees that we could use to cut and make repairs? Or let's say our ship gets wrecked here. What kind of food and water is there? Are there springs that we could drink from? Are there animals we could hunt? Are there fruits we can eat? Or, if our ship gets wrecked here, are the locals going to welcome us? Are they going to worship us as gods? Are they going to cook us and eat us? What do we have to expect? The Navy needed to know information about animals, plants, rocks, and things like that about the places where its ships were likely to sail. And Fitzroy was looking for a naturalist, meaning somebody who could describe and study the animals and plants and rocks and everything else. And he asked around here and there. He asked around among his friends. And he asked a friend of his who was a professor at Cambridge University named John Stevens Henslow. And Fitzroy asked Henslow, hey, would you like to come and be the ship's naturalist on a 3-year cruise to South America? And Henslow says, I'd love to go. And Henslow's wife says, yes, dear, you can go. And Henslow says, I better not go. It's just, if those of you who are married or those of you who will be, there are times that when your spouse gives you permission, your spouse really doesn't mean it. And this was one of those times. So poor Henslow never got to go himself. But he just so happened to tell Captain Fitzroy about a student of his who had just graduated. Still in his, I think he was 22. He'd taken a bunch of classes in biology and geology, rocks and plants and things like that. So he was quite knowledgeable about science at the time. More importantly, he was very easy to get along with and very nice, which matters because on a ship, remember that you're packed in really tight quarters, right? You're going to be smelling each other's feet for 3 years. There's no place to get away from it all because you're on a 100-foot ship in the middle of the damn ocean. Where are you going to go, right? You can't just go out for a long walk if you need to cool down. And that ship was going to be probably in some danger. Storms and things like that can happen at any time, and was going to be out of communication for weeks on end. These days, Navy sailors have, very good internet access. This was not available, and it might be many weeks before you could, send a letter home or get a letter, if it even reached you at all. So it was very important to be able to get along with people. If you were somebody who blew up easily or had, annoying personal habits that you weren't willing to modify, that voyage was going to be hell. And this guy was really, really nice. Very kind, very easy to get along with, made friends very easily, not real pushy, and also very knowledgeable. And he was actually preparing for a career as a minister. He had just gotten his degree in theology, right? The study of religion. And if it hadn't been for Fitzroy, he probably would have become a minister in the Church of England, the Anglican Church. And yet here he was, and he gets an offer from Fitzroy saying, in effect, hey, would you like to go sail to South America for 3 years? As it turned out, the voyage would end up taking almost 5 years and would go all the way around the world. And so this student said, heck yeah, I want to go. And the student naturally asked his dad, and his dad said, oh, I don't know about this. And the student said, oh, come on, Dad. And Dad eventually said, okay, you can go. Well, it didn't happen quite that way, but that's pretty much the way it worked out. And Her Majesty's ship Beagle left England on December 27th, 1831, with our young college graduate on board, a fellow by the name of Charles Darwin, or as I call him, Chuck D. And the Beagle got to South America early in 1832. And they spent the next 3 years going up and down the Atlantic coast of South America, from Brazil all the way down to the southern tip of Argentina and the Falkland Islands and back, mapping and charting those coastlines. We don't really have time to discuss everything that Darwin saw and did on that voyage. That's the Beagle, by the way, off the southern tip of South America, a big island called Tierra del Fuego, encountering some of the locals. The southernmost of all Native Americans lived down there, called the Yamana people, some of whom he got to know. And he got to see rainforests, and he got to, ride with the Argentinian cowboys, the gauchos, and he got to see cities and things. He had lots of time because, since he didn't actually have duties as part of the ship's crew, he could afford to take long trips inland. So he would get to leave the Beagle and go traveling a lot. And he collected a lot of fossils and described them, and collected, bird skins and mammal skins and rock samples and things like that, and was able to ship those back to England. And we just don't have time to discuss everything that he saw and did. His diary did get published, as it's usually published now under the title Voyage of the Beagle. If you have an interest in the history of, sailing ships and voyages of exploration, it's still not a bad read. And of course, it's freely available online if you ever care to take a look. So we haven't got time in this brief class for everything that he saw and did, much of which was important. But there's that map again. After nearly 3 years, they had explored all of the Atlantic coast of South America. They sailed around the southern tip of South America. They actually found a new passageway that connected the Atlantic and the Pacific, that's still called the Beagle Channel. And then they sailed up the Pacific coast of South America. They explored Chile and Peru. And once they'd gotten up to Peru, everybody was really sick and tired of each other, and they were ready to go home. And they started sailing across the Pacific, and would eventually sail all the way through the Pacific Islands to New Zealand, to Australia, across the Indian Ocean, and then around the around the Cape of Good Hope, around the southern tip of Africa, back up the Atlantic, and eventually back to England in 1836. And I'll focus on just one brief episode. After they had been going up and down the South American coast, as they turned and headed for home, they stopped for food and water at some islands in the Pacific Ocean, 600 miles off the coast of what's now the country of Ecuador. And this is what they look like. The islands where they stopped are very dry. They're volcanic. They're basically made up of solidified lava erupted by volcanoes. They can be very harsh. The islands can go through some terribly severe droughts. These are not the sort of islands where you can just, sit on a beach and sip fruity rum drinks with paper umbrellas in them. These really are desert islands. They're located right across the equator itself, and they're called the Galapagos Islands. Galapago is the local word for giant land tortoise, which they have on these islands. I'll show you one in a bit. We know the Galapagos Islands are volcanic, and eruptions still happen to this day. Last I looked, there was a small lava flow back in January of this year. The last major eruption was in June 2018. And what you're looking at here, this dark, kind of ropey, ripply looking stuff, is a congealed lava flow. looking a bit like, if you poured hot fudge, if you're making fudge and you poured hot fudge onto a cold tray, it would actually make shapes very much like this. Anyway, relatively speaking, and we know this partly from fossils, they are much, much younger than the South American mainland. Even though radiometric dating wasn't discovered at the time, although it would later be applied, Darwin recognized that only relatively very young fossils were present on the Galapagos, much younger than most of the older ones that you'd find on the South American mainland, using, Smith's laws. Okay, so what? The cool thing about the Galapagos is there's a lot of species that are only found in the Galapagos and nowhere else in the world. This is one. This is Buteo galapagensis, the Galapagos hawk. It is in the same genus as birds that you might see around here. The red-tailed hawk is Buteo jamacensis. I'm drawing a blank on what the red-shouldered hawk is, but that's another one that I've seen in Conway that's in the genus Buteo. So the Galapagos hawk is very similar to red-tailed hawks, but it's not identical. The Galapagos hawk is, in fact, a separate species, and it's found nowhere else in the world but the Galapagos Islands. Okay, so what? If you don't like hawks, you might like penguins. The Galapagos penguin is similar to penguins that you could find in South America. They don't only live on Antarctica itself. There are penguins that live in southern South America and southern Africa and southern Australia. And the Galapagos penguin looks like South American penguins, but it's different enough that we call it a separate species, Spheniscus mendiculus. It's only found in the Galapagos, and in fact, because the Galapagos Islands straddle the equator, it's the only penguin that's naturally found in the northern hemisphere, albeit by only a couple of miles. So penguins are almost all found in the southern hemisphere only, but this one actually gets a toe over the equator. And it's unique to the Galapagos. And there are, there's 3 species of mockingbird found only in the Galapagos. There's several species of tomato, wild tomato plant that are only found in the Galapagos. I think there's at least one rodent that's only found in the Galapagos. There are iguanas found in the Galapagos. There's actually 2 species of marine iguana. And iguanas are naturally found in South America. I actually had a student years ago that had one as a pet, and certainly you could see some in, I think the Little Rock Zoo has some. So iguanas are pretty widespread, but the Galapagos iguanas are unique. What they'll do is sit on rocks and warm up and soak up the sun, and then jump into the cold seawater and swim around in sea. And when they get chilled, they'll climb back up on the rocks and warm up again, and then wash, rinse, and repeat. And then they'll jump off the rocks and go swimming around and eating seaweed. That's kind of weird. You don't think of lizards as being prone to swimming in the ocean eating seaweed, but there you have it. That makes these unique. And Darwin found that this is true of a whole bunch of Galapagos animals and plants. Probably the most famous Galapagos life forms that Darwin studied is a group of seed-eating birds called finches. Finches are widespread. You have seen finches in your backyard. The cardinal is a finch, and that's a bird I'm assuming that everybody has seen at some point. We also have purple finches in Arkansas, although those are less commonly seen. There's finches all over the place, but there's a couple of genera of finches that consist of species that are only found in the Galapagos, nowhere else in the world. This is one of them. This is the small ground finch, Geospiza fuliginosa. Turns out there are 14 species of finch in the Galapagos Islands. And different species, for one thing, are found on different islands. There is some overlap, but you don't find all 14 species on one single island. More to the point, each species has a distinctive way of life, and each one shows features that enable it to follow that way of life, adaptations, as we'd call it. That small ground finch specializes on eating small plant seeds, and as such, it's got a small beak, suitable for picking up and handling small seeds. On the right, the large ground finch, Geospiza magnorostris, has a humongous beak. That one's adapted to feed on large seeds, and it's got a large beak that can handle large seeds, that can pick them up, and that can generate enough force to break them open. So it doesn't eat the same seeds that the small ground finch does. It shows adaptations to a different diet and a slightly different way of life. The cactus finch on the left, Geospiza scandens, has a much longer beak, and it's not nearly as chunky as the large ground finch. It's long and it's narrow. That's the kind of beak you want if you live on Galapagos prickly pear cactus. And oh yes, the Galapagos have several species of prickly pear cactus that are unique to the Galapagos. And the cactus finch feeds on cactus fruit, flowers, and bugs, and has a long and narrow beak that comes in handy if you're getting your food from a plant that has a whole lot of very big spines. You could compare the beak of the large ground finch to, a heavy pair of pliers, and the cactus finch's beak be more like a set of needle nose pliers or something like that. Each one's good at doing certain things and not so good at others. So you've got 14 different species of finch in the Galapagos. They're all recognizably finches. They've got all of the features of the skeleton and overall, structure of the body that lets us call them finches. And yet each one's different. The differences are related to the type of life that they lead. The finches show what we now call adaptations, physical features that enable them to get food and be successful in the lifestyle that they have. And all of them are found only on the Galapagos Islands, nowhere else in the world. They all share a common structure. That's the small beaked ground finch on the left and the large beaked on the right. They all share a common structure. They're adapted to different lifestyles. The beak is the most obvious place in which that's reflected. They're all similar to South American finches known as grassquits. This is a South American grassquit bird, Tierras bicolor. They resemble the South American species, but they're not the same. They are unique to the Galapagos. You find them nowhere else in the world. And we already have reason to believe, by looking at the rocks and the fossils, that the Galapagos Islands are relatively young. They're much younger than the South American mainland. There's just a couple more. The woodpecker finch on the left, that's a bird that feeds on insects living in decaying wood, and it'll actually pick up a stick in its beak. That's what it's doing right there, and use it to probe and poke around in rotting wood and tree bark to disturb insects, termites and things like that, which it promptly snaps up and eats. So yeah, it's a tool-using bird, which is kind of neat. And it's called the woodpecker finch. On the right, I like this. The vampire finch specializes in sneaking up behind nesting seabirds and pecking them with their beaks and drinking the blood. So the vampire finch will, take you by surprise and stab you in the and I think I used pizza difficilis right there. Here's the thing. Why would you, we have woodpeckers and flickers are birds that you might know that poke around in wood, especially decaying old wood, for insects and then eat them. That's what woodpeckers are doing when they peck at trees. Why do you have a finch that probes in wood for insects like a woodpecker, but not have an actual woodpecker? You know, why are there not woodpeckers, but rather there are finches that act like woodpeckers? That's kind of weird. How did you get finches that are blood drinkers? Like, that's almost unprecedented among birds. How did that even happen? Why are all these finches only in the Galapagos, in these islands that we think are comparatively very young, certainly compared to the South American mainland? Why aren't they anywhere else? As Darwin wrote, seeing this gradation and diversity of structure in one small, intimately related group of birds, one might really fancy that from an original paucity of birds in this archipelago, meaning an original small number of birds in this group of islands, one species had been taken and modified for different ends. Huh, crazy idea. It's almost as if you started with one species of finch in the Galapagos Islands and changed it in some way and somehow made it turn into new species of finch. Crazy talk, I know, nutty. But it was an idea that Darwin was to ponder as the Beagle sailed back across the Pacific and around Africa, back through the Atlantic, getting back to England in October of 1836. Darwin lived in London for a while. He got married. They ended up buying this house, which used to be in a quiet country village, but is now part of suburban London because London has grown crazy big. And it's maintained as a museum that you can visit. Restored to the way it would have looked when Darwin and his wife and his kids lived there. And Darwin lived there until he died in 1882, called Down House. Right. He had a lot to do when he got back. There were various projects that he had to work on. And he still had time to think about this strange possibility. Maybe, just maybe, biological species weren't fixed. That there was some process by which they could change. They could change over time, over not a single lifespan, but over many generations. This is not change within a lifespan like Pichu changing to Pikachu, changing to Raichu, or whatever it is, but change from one generation to the next spread out over many, many generations. That species could somehow change their nature and adapt to the environment that they found themselves in. Were that true, it would seem to explain a lot of things that Darwin had noticed, and not only Darwin, it would seem to explain a lot of things that many other scientists had also been noticing at about this time. This idea that species were capable of change. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and stop there. I've got 10:52. Let's reconvene at 11:05, and I'll stop recording.